Welcome to Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Litfest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan, Bios and Bookmarks Project Manager, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to episode 4 of season 5, which has been all about telling complex family stories. Today's guest is Arisa White, a Cave Canem Fellow, Sarah Lawrence College alumna, an MFA graduate of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Arisa is the author of several poetry chapbooks and full-length collections. Her most recent publication, Who's Your Daddy?, is a poetic memoir published by Augury Books. As the creator of the Beautiful Words Project, Arisa curates creative collaborations that center narratives on women, queer, and trans people of color. She is Assistant Professor of English and Creative Writing at Colby College. Arisa is joined today by our special guest host, Andre Bagoo, who returns to us for his second episode of Season 5. Andre is a poet, journalist, non-fiction writer, and winner of the 2021 OCM Bocas Non-Fiction Prize for his collection of essays, The Undiscovered Country, published by People Tree Press. I'm certain that Andre and Arisa are going to have a rich and illuminating conversation. I want to invite all of you, from wherever you're joining us around the world, to sit back, relax. Don't be afraid to speak up in our live comments. And if you enjoy this episode and our numerous other creative projects over the years, please consider joining us at the Friends of Bocas Lit Fest, about which you'll hear a little bit at the end of this episode. Thank you, and happy viewing.
Jay Bagoo, your guest host for today. And as Shivani mentioned, our program features the poet Arisa White. Welcome, Arisa.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation, Andre.
So am I. So one of the things I've noticed about Who's Your Daddy is that it is incredibly lyrical. It's lyrical in the sense of both the narrow and the broad meaning of the word. It's very much concerned with the voice, and I think with musicality, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you read from it for that reason. But also, I think your book is the quintessential example of lyricism in the sense of a writer moving through time, flitting through time, telling this story, this narrative over time, and all of the growth and the change that involves, like a bird flittering from different branches. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about the book and perhaps share with us a reading from it?
Will do. So Who's Your Daddy took about 7 years to write. It started off it started off when my mother asked me if I wanted to write my father in Guyana. It was my 33rd birthday, my Jesus year. So my mother gave me this invitation to connect with my father. And at first I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to write. So much distance was between us. Last time I saw him, I was about 3 years old. So I spent, some years really just writing these letters, these epistolary poems, which are poems written in a form of letters. And then I started to invite other people to write letters to their absent, estranged fathers, patriarchal figures as well. It was during the time when Trump was being elected in the US. I was also able to procure a grant that allowed me to kind of extend this project beyond just myself and welcome in collective voices to really mine a silence that I knew wasn't my own. And so with that same grant, I was also able to go to Guyana and meet my father after 30 plus years of estrangement. And at that time, I put together all of the epistolary poems into a self-publication that was called Dear Gerald. And so the point was to kind of go to Guyana, give him this collection of poems, and just also to reconnect and see his hometown, see his home country. And then after I came back from Guyana, I thought it was done. I fulfilled my grant obligation. But I had journal entries, I had newspaper clippings, I also had these letters from other people. I had several letters from inmates at San Quentin. One letter came as far as the Philippines. And so I had all of this material. I was also reading work on fatherhood and what does it mean to be a father over like the centuries, and particularly for Black men, all of these kinds of family cultural studies. So I was like, I wind up sending out a newsletter to, I guess, friends and family and fans. And my undergraduate professor from Sarah Lawrence, Ogayemi, wrote back and said to me, there are many books to be written, and you need to write a book about fathers and to be kind to them. And so I was charged by Ogayemi to do more. And also having that particular kind of this assignment to write about fathers and be kind, that kind of emotional tension really put me in a place to think about how do I pull all of these voices, all of this material to create something that feels both personal and also collective. So I will just begin reading some sections from the opening, and maybe I'll flip around throughout. So I will begin with the prologue, and the prologue is actually a combination of my words, the lyrical, as well as sentences taken from the letter that my mother wrote to her estranged father. Prologue. This is a grandfather feeling. Here these walls convert into a perpetual bloom of cherry blossoms. Petals as understudies for tears in constant descent when repressed grief climbs up my mother's chest. The grief is her father's shape. She never heard his I love you. Cheated with a white woman, gambled away and didn't pay taxes on the family house. His bags brimmed with hurt shirts and broken trousers. My mother's petals. Dad, remember you used to take me to the bar. My mother's petals. In return, all the men I lust, I let break me. My mother's petals. It's difficult to say, I love you. I move at the durational speed of this grief water, a rhythm that suits the running man. My mother is 19 when she meets Gerald. Handsome, tall, good, healthy teeth, dressed sharp and debonair, he could steal the room. She felt lucky he chose her. 10 years her senior, and she smiles mostly to herself, remembering him teaching her how to drive. All the places she goes, in his Cadillac down Fulton Street, down Nostrand Ave, without question up and down Atlantic and Pacific, DeKalb, on Eastern Parkway, through Gates and Myrtle, Bushwick and Halsey, sunsets on J. Down this first day of spring, red lights every 2 minutes when contractions start. The cab ride stretches out before the hospital. I am her second child. She has calm nerves, clear expectations, controlled breath, an easy birth. And what she negotiated with Gerald, a married man, about his role in my care definitely included a one-way street. At 4 years old, I hide behind the door to the bedroom I shared with my siblings. painted royal blue, and I see all the ways my cousin was too heavy with the paint. We are living in a 2-bedroom apartment on Fulton Street in Brooklyn. Gerald comes for a visit, which will be his last, and it is just me and my mother in the apartment. The place is clean, frankincense burning, pine salt mop floors, and this royal blue I've cornered myself in. Maybe Gerald will not find me here. He doesn't know the floor plan, how I find comfort in closets, in corners where I do not punish myself, but pray. Pray where I am the quietest conversation with myself. But Gerald finds me. Calling my name lures me from believing I am an island. Pulls me across waters so indigo there is no bottom. Welcomes me on a shore that slips and slips from under me until my feet trust again. I hear him loud and clear. Why you running from me? I am your father. My feet resign. Father isn't a place from which I can run. Those bangles were Guyanese gold, my mother recollects. Still bothered that I, as a first grader, ignore her instructions not to take them off and set the pair of bangles inside my desk. Each chime, my teacher stops dead in her writing on the blackboard or looks up from her desk to notice me. Her look turns me red-handed. Each time I've moved, this bright gold jingle undermines the control she has over us. Our silence is a sign of obedience and respect. She is known for being a disciplinarian, quick to lesson you with an outdated insult like, don't be a bump on a log, or stupid is as stupid does, or outright pops you in the back of your head with her pencil, or gets in your face and yells herself flush. Because nobody needs such noise, I toss the bangles in a trash pile on our way to the cafeteria. When I come home, wrist free, I tell my mother they fell off. I don't remember this, but my mother says I bumped into Gerald on Nostrand Avenue. I am soon to graduate elementary school. My memory, musk and incense, the weather, kerchiefs flagging in pockets, antennae clearing waves. She says this happened, but what I hear, Gerald's unhello moving southbound with traffic. Where he stood, concrete and haunt of curry, knockoff handbags, bootleg videos, not a beard or brow, style of shirt. He could be anybody. I believe in God. I talk to myself. I sometimes sing from the 4th floor of our apartment into a sky as starlit as it was going to get in Brooklyn. 5th grade, my voice on cruise as Rose Royce. I'm wishing on a star to follow where you are. I'm wishing on a dream to follow what it means. And my neighbors holler back, shut the fuck up. They weren't ready for this songbird. Friends never really ask about fathers. To ask is to sometimes signal a personal failure. But when we feel triumphant from figuring out how to play handball with all 3 of us, it comes up. Nicole, with her round cheeks, dimples dipping into them, undoes, then meticulously fastens the Velcro straps on her Reebok classics. I often wonder, I wonder most. I become a homing signal, an umbilical cord. My father, a rum zero, will never add my expectations, my deepest needs, and the years divide us. She pauses and turns and looks at me and Sophia, our backs against the handball wall. I'm watching for that ultramarine sky that marks when I need to be home. Nicole's eyes are asking, is my father some kind of dream, reeking of crazy and Old Spice, simply a distance in everything? Maybe, we nod. We nod soft so she knows it's not her fault he never came back from the liquor store. Sophia, whose father lives with his other family in Harlem, rolls her eyes, neck, sucks her teeth, inspects her hot pink polish, bites off a hangnail, then spits. He's nothing but a warm brown set of limbs, never thinking, never knowing, the appropriate measuring tool to sift his love from them to me. They clock me for my story with a silent impatience of 13-year-olds feeling fresh from sharing, and the sky is telling me to go. I rise up, dust the street off me, and the blood flows to the pens and needles. What? I never had a father. I figured you might know. We laugh something purple from our throats. It rushes forward with many rivers, freely and deep, muddy and ready for the open. And then I will read this one, close this kind of reading moment out with this. On a visit to my mother in New Jersey, from the Bay Area where I lived postgraduate school, she takes a long, good look at me. She's transported, updating her visual, taking stock of what she saw last against what's now. Her eyes treasure a find. You have Gerald's hands. Your feet are his too. I pull my hands and feet closer to where we belong. And that way you draw people to you, she says. That's his charm.
Archives, allegories, and wholly new songs. That's how the American poet Terence Hayes describes his book, and I think that perfectly captures what you've just recited for us, Arisa. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I mean, this, and thank you as well for giving us some background into this book. And, you know, this is obviously a very, all writing is personal, but this is obviously a very personal project. And I had a question about, how do you see this book? What genre do you see it as falling within? Because, you know, there's a lot of discussion about autofiction. There's a lot of questions about, well, is it life writing or is it memoir? But this book, it's a combination of so many different things. There's poetry, there's the prose poem happening within it. How do you see this book? Or should we even care what label we put onto this book?
I think it is a combination of, like, I don't care what label you put on the book, but I think for me, poetry welcomes all of those things. It welcomes the fiction. It welcomes the nonfiction, the scholarly, the lyrical, the narrative, the dramatic. And so as a genre, I feel like poetry gave me the permission to bring so many other elements into it. But and sort of like having it rest in the kind of poetic realm, the lyric, you know, and really thinking too about the lyrical as as a rhythmic connection to help me kind of populate the distance, the silence, and the emptiness with some sound waves. You know, it's like, let my voice, because my voice for me feels like, you know, poetry feels like my most authentic voice, the way in which I emotionally stand in the world. So to write Gerald, to begin conversation with Gerald in this narrative of absence, it's the lyrical, poetic voice that I had to use to speak into it, and then see what comes back to me as a result and what permissions I get. But mostly by calling it kind of the poetic memoir, I'm giving permission to myself to be creative, to be imaginative, to have these emotional moments make for a new kind of state of feeling and being, to create a kind of possibility that can't be really actualized in reality. So I feel like there is, for me, the poetic allows me to be the magic, the shape-shifting kind of creature I imagine myself to be in this narrative, in this book.
I love that you say that, because I was going to ask you a little bit about, you talked about shape shifting. I mean, some of the forms in here, I mentioned that there's prose poetry, there are stanzas, there's even haibun, you know, you have
Yes.
you have a one-line poem in here as well. You have a lot of visual elements where at one stage the lines, you know, fade into the page, fade to white. There's cento, because as you mentioned in your introduction.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you approach, and then considering your background, doing all these different things, you've written books about real life people, but you've also written operas, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
You've written young adult books. How did you think the use of form, or how did you approach form in this book in order to amplify your voice, in order to amplify that sense of yourself as a shapeshifter? Or is that a leading question? Did I just...
I think the forms allowed me to shapeshift. Like there's, you know, in thinking and using the haibun and that form very much, you know, being a prose and a kind of haiku-like ending, but it's all to capture a journey, you know? And so looking at different kinds of forms embedded in them are a kind of hybridity. Like how do we blend different techniques so that it's creating a kind of consciousness and a different way of seeing and feeling for the reader. So the prose, kind of that prose block or the sentence sets up certain kinds of expectations. But then when I fade the line or when I break it and make a kind of tanka or a haiku, then I shift your expectations. I kind of put you in a different place as well. And I think, you know, in working also with like playwriting and a libretto and these sort of dramatic forms, you're really thinking about the audience as well. Like, what am I creating for them to enter into? Like, how am I going to make them feel? How am I going to disturb them? How am I going to refresh them? So the writing is about that experience. And it's also about how can I use, say, like the directions in a play becomes, you know, actually, you know, a way for me to think about how to direct the eye, you know, the narrative eye, but also the reader's eye as well. And then also in writing about, you know, historical figures like Biddy Mason for the young readers book I did, working particularly with, an individual in a history that has been redacted or removed or silenced from the historical archives, I had to sort of learn how to imagine, how do I match myself up with the life of this individual emotionally and sort of even kind of concretely so that I can locate her in a historical moment, but also bring that historical moment to a present moment as well. And so kind of having to create a historical figure out of silences sort of set me up to really think about, how do I write about distance and estrangement? How do I write about how that distance and estrangement governs my life, even in this presence? And so all of those forms come together to really create shape for something that isn't there. And I felt like I just couldn't rely on just one form, because I was inviting so many voices, citing scholars. I have Erica Badu lyrics throughout. Artists are speaking. Even the piece that I read about the friends playing handball and talking about fathers, that is also a combination of like letters and poems I received from other people. So it was just really like the material before me was teaching me that this book had to match and sort of resemble the process that made it.
And certainly that process is one that is, you mentioned wanting to take readers on a journey. That process feels palpable. We get a sense, I think one of the distinctive features of this book is that we get a sense while we're reading it of the book actually revising itself. It's the thinking of I'll call it the narrative voice. Or I can say you, but no. We get a sense of, ideas come up, and then, not to reveal too much, those ideas are then challenged almost, towards the end. But even within the space of a poem, the idea can be challenged. And I wondered, how important was that to you? Because I think, at this moment in time, people can be so rigid and dogmatic, and they just have one position and that's it, and they just stick to that. And I guess you've kind of hinted as a way of reading this book as also being about, well, wanting to chafe against boundaries of all forms. How do you see that as something that you deliberately tried to do in this book? Is that something that you're concerned with, getting people to have a more nuanced or fluid way of thinking about things?
Yes, definitely a fluid way of thinking. That's one of the major motifs in the book, and also kind of astrologically, I'm a Pisces, so part of that shape shifting is to be a fish in this like narrative water, so that I can get to Guyana, which translates to the land of many waters. But in thinking about your question, this book had a few iterations, right? So Dear Gerald, the first kind of iteration of it all, is just these epistolary poems. And I would say they were of one kind of emotion, like anger, confusion, sadness. And it was just there, but it was also a kind of practice of how do I speak of my day-to-day life, the things that don't necessarily feel poetic, right? It's like, but how do I reveal just like riding a bus, going to the chiropractor, getting fired, and that also being a part of the exchange. So in that way, I was breaking out of, some writerly patterns I have, because I would always think like some important major moment in my life had to be recorded or documented or made poem. But with that first collection of the Dear Gerald epistolary poems, I was more focused on how do I introduce Gerald to the boring, quotidian, mundane details of my life, as well as how do I explore my feelings for someone and something that wasn't there or present. But yet so many people sort of externally, I'm supposed to be angry, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there was already that kind of emotional tension. And then when I open it up to other people with the letters, what I'm starting to get and notice is a kind of same old story. It's like it was almost like we were kin. It was like we had the same father. So there was a certain kind of repetition, and in that repetition was this trying to, once again, no one could really settle on like a definitive feeling. And then I'm bringing in the sort of scholarly, the musical, the abstract, some esoteric religious stuff as well. So it become these other voices to think about how to think about this particular situation, how to think about patriarchy, how to think about Black masculinity and fatherhood in a social environment that doesn't allow for that to be a successful thing within the Black families unit in the United States, right? So all of these things are coming from all different directions, and I just can't be mad. I actually have to be a combination of so many other feelings like joy and confusion, confusion and, sadness. So for me, it was like really creating these nuanced combination of feelings because it just isn't clear, like it wasn't clear. It still feels a little fuzzy, but by reading and writing and being in conversation, I was able to orient myself to my father and to the subject of, sort of deadbeat dads in a way that wasn't one note. And that's what I needed to actually move the narrative along, is these multiple notes that I can kind of compose and orchestrate to make a complicated, unified sound about this issue of, who's the father, who's your daddy. It's going to be a multi-vocal response.
Also very multivocal and complex is, I think, this idea of nationhood, which obviously resonates or parallels or is symbolized by the search for father or the father figure that, as you say, not only you identify with, but so many others. I just had a question to ask. I mean, there's a scene in the book where somebody asks you, "Are you Guyanese?" And you're quite clear, no. And I think your partner's like, "But no, you're Guyanese American. You're Guyanese American." So tell us a little bit more about that. Can you? Are you intimidated by this idea of Guyanese hood, or what's your relationship with Guyana now?
I think right now I have like a creative relationship to Guyana, and having traveled there, it just opened up the place from my imagination to a real space with people and being able to interact and kind of come into a part of my identity that was lost, in many ways. It was kind of, obscured. I mean, the kind of funny part about this is that my stepfather was Guyanese. However, for so many years, I thought, and my other siblings thought, he was Jamaican, because that was like the identity that was most readable in the United States. So instead of saying like, Guyana, Guyanese, people would be like, what are you talking about? And so, he would just say, "I'm Jamaican."
Jamaicans very vexed right now.
I sure did.
They're like, "What?"
I know, but this is what happened. So I just remember one time we were my family was sitting. We're like, "What? Why did you all confuse us like that?" So there you go. We have on this one level, it's like, oh, my stepfather is Jamaican. Okay. But, we're learning, culturally Guyanese traditions and food and all of that stuff. And it's not until late teens that we find out the truth of his origins. So there's that element. So it's all of this uncovering had to happen. So, and in that way, it was how do I embrace it when I was told this, but then, oh no, this got revealed. And so I didn't feel legitimately like I culturally sort of earned the title of Guyanese. I felt like a bit of a fraud in some way, honestly. But I think, having that moment in Guyana when being asked, are you Guyanese? There was immediately this reaction of no, it's I'm just visiting. And then my partner saying to me no, slow down, stop being in reaction. We're actually in a new part of your life and a new revision of this old story where you're actually embracing that part of you and who you are, to integrate it and bring it more fully into my life and into the way that I situate and identify in the world. So it's a slow but loving embrace.
I absolutely, I love that answer, and I love how in the book, there's this kind of a candidness as well, because yes, we in the Caribbean we'll take offense if we are say you call me Barbadian. What? No,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
not me personally. I'm just, but but the ironic thing is, the Caribbean nations and the islands, we have distinct histories and
Mhm.
distinct ways of speaking and even genetics, but ultimately there's so much more that connects us and that's
Mhm.
similar to us. We like to pretend that doesn't exist. We like to, oh no, we're not, but because actually when I was going through the list of proverbs that you use as section
Mhm.
dividers or as epigraphs, blood follows the veins, the moon runs until the day catches it.
Mhm.
I was struck by how these were very much resonant with a lot of the similar sort of sayings we have here in Trinidad.
Oh,
And
wow.
it got me thinking about, well, actually, yeah, this situation of fatherhood and the search for fatherhood, it's actually something we all identify with
Mhm.
all over the Caribbean and indeed all over the world, But as you pinpointed, especially in societies with a specific history of slavery, perhaps.
Mhm.
Um, but certainly that search for fatherhood is something that crosses nations. And so don't feel like a fraud. Don't feel like, I mean, that's how people here feel too sometimes.
Okay, that's good to know.
So, so because we're talking about Guyana, let me ask you a little bit about that closing movement of the book, which is extraordinary. I mean, it's the entire book is incredibly moving, but I think going back to the lyricism in the sense of moving over time, we get this chronological sense in the beginning, and a lot of time we skip over time within the space of a few lines in the first few sections of the book. And
Mhm.
then we come to just a few days actually in the end, and it's this explosion of writing. I don't know how else to describe it, but the syntax, everything, it changes, and I think that reflects a very sensory kind of perception of the actual space of Guyana.
Mm.
Guyana comes to life in this book, and I was wondering about your process of writing that last section, and also the process of calibrating the journey as a whole across the book. How did you
Yeah.
set about to do that?
It's interesting. I'm glad you asked about that. That last section of the book is actually what is inspiring me to do a dramatic reading at the planetarium that I've been working on for the past few months. That section that was like the first section I wrote, and that is essentially, so after Guyana, I had my journal entries. And I was actually spending some time in the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. There was an exhibit of contemporary South African artists there, and I was there for it's about the summertime, so about 2 months, and just looking at their artwork and getting really inspired by the motif of that indigo royal cobalt blue that was just in everyone's work. It's like the diaspora gave us all this kind of color to speak to the river crossing and the ocean crossing that we've all had to endure and needed to get to where we are now. And so that's when my voice for this book, the new iteration that is now Who's Your Daddy, came about because of looking at that blue, and it was pushing the poetic line into a sentence, which startled me because I'm like, oh my God, I'm working in sentences. How do I maintain the rhythm? How do I keep the lyricism going? But I just went with it. And what gave me the permission to actually start writing Who's Your Daddy was seeing that last scene, which is a star ceremony at the seawall at the Atlantic, where I integrate my grandfather, Gerald's father, with him in this kind of starlight ceremony, because essentially what I learned in visiting Guyana is that, you know, my father did not get to, you know, say goodbye to his father who was brutally killed. He actually foresaw that death when he was 10 years old. And then the family thought he like possessed some sort of evil spirit as a result of it. And so that began this kind of, I would say, a kind of spiritual disconnection from the family. So I wrote that scene. I knew I could write Who's Your Daddy because I had that kind of magical scene already in my eye, and I wrote it out. And I actually was afraid of it because it was so sentimental. It was like everything I was taught sort of not to do, like in school, especially in graduate school. It's like, here I have like the alphabet being a chant. I'm calling on the grandfather. I mean, it was just, I just had like, I loved it in the sense of like, it pushed me so far out of my habits of writing that I had to embrace it. It was like, this is my new thing. And so that's, you know, so we have that more prosy, explosive section because that came out very close to after I left Guyana. And so the place was rich. The news articles that I read was still there. And I could just see how my voice was starting to make sense of this journey. And I just got it on the page. So that was actually a much sort of broader and longer section that I wind up then sending to my publisher. And my publisher editor was like, this is amazing. This is great, which I was like, thank you for saying that, because I was really nervous about it. But then she said to me, now we need to extend this out and bring in your childhood. How did you get to Guyana? And so I was like, yes, that makes sense, but I don't want to write those parts. And I also had to think, because this is also, it was a challenge too, because with my first poetry collection, Hurrah's Nest, I wrote a lot about, you know, growing up in Brooklyn, all of these kind of key moments in my childhood. So for me, it was like, I like just have people read Hurrah's Nest, you know, but I was sort of challenged to think about what can I say and tell about childhood and young adulthood, you know, late 20s and early 30s that I haven't talked about yet. So that last section helped me develop the motifs and the symbols and the extended metaphors I needed so that I can get to that last section of the book.
Wow. We're going to open the floor to questions shortly, but before we do, I don't know, Arisa, if you could share with us just another snippet from the book.
Yes, I will. Okay, just lost my place. I'm sorry. So I'll read two pieces. Actually, I'll read three. I think I have time for three. At the darkest hour, there is no demand to show, to dissemble, to give. I unhook my breast to spill to gravity, sink into the bath. Orange blossoms stick to my skin like mother's kisses and overdue apologies. The peppermint soap mentholates and constellates my interior. Stars go through the Florida water to shine. Deep breaths open my tight chest, and I feel how running has taken more than given. I rub my heart with the heel of my palm, and my heart stays voicing. Find your father. Find what's missing there. Find what is enough. Find yourself whole. Forgive and be forgiven. What is my spiritual condition? I go from numb to wonder. Monday ways framed by the window, street light halos her head, crescent moon in the upper right pane, an exponent to her temple. I sit between her legs to get my hair done, the combing, then pomade, the massage over my scalp. She lifts my skull, stretches my stem, and my marooned thick hair she plaits fishtail. Once completed, Monday Way serves me a glass of welcome, says swim. First, there is sand. My body moves across the rough translation of my name. The sandbar's coarse gravel on my feet is pressure in my lungs, expanding to hold a maiden volume of resurrection. The surf washes me of the terms by which I've been assembled on land. I don't see the plunge coming. I find myself deep and salted, water walking the league that holds me buoyant. I feel the resonance of ocean great and grand, the way it is one teardrop gigantic, and God, the mother father of them all, speaks to me. It is that rebel pearl diver blood who makes you other than what is expected. It is Negra Azalia, Venezuelan born, beneath shade of trees that scream their hurt when roots are torn. Isla de las Lágrimas. She is the woman who planted your freedom. She is the terra that features most. Without words, who I am is answered. You are that depth of sea survived. When a mother-father says ship, a mother-father means the one from Dutch. Prima madre in its belly, learning ways she is flesh around a seed. Azalia in her womb. When we say ship, we mean Prima was. Shipped, then shipped, she didn't know where she was. Without question, I know where I am bound. She wanted for her daughter swimming ways. Cape Verde, her island, taught her so. Prima slaved for pearls, carried down into feet by boulders. Prima's body greased, a slick allegiance to finding Negra Paca's black pearl. In a league she couldn't quite descend, in the mouth of a diver named Paca was Prima's freedom. The pearl the size of your eye, and many lost sight getting to it. What emerged from Prima's darkest deep wasn't the jewel of another's suffering, but home she tasted too frequently in these waters. She blacked out, gave up her air for the drink of it, and rested. A blue-black darkness guides me forward, and I am following Azalia, following Prima, a glowing trinity of albino manta rays, light where Paca drowned. The black pearl set in her mouth. I come from Azalia's lips, that kiss that takes the pearl. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much as well for telling us that journey of how you came to, carve out this trajectory for the book. What I love about what you've just read is how the book is talking a lot about the intergenerational effects of loss and silence and the absences, the grandfather to father to current generation. But it's also very much pivoted on this idea, this notion that your relationships are affected by these things as well. And I mean,
yes.
This book and some of the Rios in this book go through a little trauma, and it's actually very, very important, the relationships in that regard, because that is what, the narrative leads you finally to say, let me confront this silence. How important was that to you to show, well, yeah, there are actually other repercussions. It's not just me and my family.
Yes, it was key. I think that was like the emotional impulse to it all. In one way it could, it could have been kept simple, right? But when I started to sort of feel the absence in me and the different ways in which it would take shape and form certain kinds of emotional experiences, or the inability to express myself emotionally, or this kind of absence and this abandonment, primed me for feeling like I wasn't important, that there was no value in sort of learning to communicate my needs and ask for what I needed. So instead, what takes over is like all of the sadness, all of the anger, all of that, you know, just mucky messiness of being abandoned. And it shows up in these close, intimate relationships that I have, and the ways in which I then don't show up for other people, the ways in which I abandon situations emotionally and physically, the ways in which I use distance to sort of step in as my proxy in order to not deal with conflict, which then winds up creating more conflict. And so I had to like really recognize like, oh, this is all a part of, you know, of root, of sort of these like root parental, you know, things that they kind of like, sometimes, you know, I try to think of them as gifts in a way, like going through therapy, you know, the sort of challenges of childhood and the things that your parents didn't work on becomes your work to do. And so I had to learn to do the work of speaking in this silence, of healing the abandonment, and also setting boundaries too, learning to set boundaries and recognize my limits. All of that kind of work is just the work that really pushed me emotionally to want to connect to my father, to be able to ask and know some things that I didn't know I needed to know or hear. You know, like I needed to hear my father say, I love you. You know, I needed my father to be accountable for the ways his involvement in criminal activities took him away, you know, to sort of see that. I needed those things. And then the sort of flip side of that, I then learned how to say no to him when my certain limitations weren't, when I reached my limitations around certain things, so that I didn't develop resentment or animosity. So all of this really taught me how to, you know, develop new tools for how to be with people versus how to be without them.
I just, wow. I think it is so incredibly moving, you know, and one of there's a moment in the book where the narrator says, you know, they've been reducing the other person to some triggering trope. And so both parties go missing in the exchange.
Yes.
And I thought that was such a profound insight, you know, and it applied to so much in the book. And it was really, really something that struck me as universal, because you know, this is a very personal story, but again, you're really transcending a lot of boundaries here, and a lot of people will identify with this experience and these experiences. I just want to, so many, we're getting lots of wonderful responses from the audience. I just want to read a comment from Martina McPowell, who says they are so grateful for your voice, wisdom, and light. And they put a little heart sign there.
Thanks.
You previously said, and I think, you know, we're coming close to closing, but I'll just ask this. You previously, you know, you've written in one of your previous books, you said that the labels we use to name present us with a loss. To name a person and an experience or an object means we see it for that purpose, that utility, and gone to us is the what else, the possibilities that the label can't encompass. And I think philosophically, this is such an incredible kind of encapsulation of a lot of, I guess, your writing as a whole, but certainly for this book, because it's you speak of mining the silence and then going on the search to fill that silence, to confront something, and then it is almost as though as soon as it is found, it disappears again. Not because it's no longer of value to us, so we no longer love it, or it's no longer important, but because now that process of going on that journey we've grown, and the parameters have changed, and I am so fascinated by that, that kind of transition, so to speak. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit more about it. I've been talking. Where's the question?
No, it's true. And I think it's also, the thing that I feel as I get older and spend more time with language and spend more time with people, it's like like our identities serve a certain purpose in the sort of social and political realm. It has a way of sort of signaling our social location. But then when you arrive there, there's so much more. And I think what the label confuses us in thinking that we know what we will arrive at or who we will arrive at. And it also makes us believe we know what we can say to them or expect from them. And it sets up a kind of expected conversation. And none of that is true. And I think it's like the label can bring us there, but then we have to do the work of showing up and being vulnerable, having conflict. And how does that conflict help us adjust? And how do we have conflict without causing harm? And, and sort of putting people in places where they feel invisible or not recognized or overtaken, right? So the arrival to the identity is just one step of getting there. And then we have to figure out and build our tools for being with each other, being with. And so I think that's what I'm recognizing at this point in my life, and in this point, even with language, is that in some ways I'm casting a spell to kind of bring you into a realm of consciousness. And in that state of consciousness, what do you feel? What do you know? What do you become open to? And then how do we expand our sort of tool set for being with each other, for speaking with each other, for feeling each other, for allowing our spirits to kind of be in the place that is being created, with us and for us. So I think it's just, recognizing that there's much work to do in how we relate, and we got to do better with it too. And the label is not the work at all. It's just how to get there.
It's almost the start. It's just the beginning.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, needing to hold the father figure accountable, and Tara Ragbir, points out, yes, the other side of that is, of course, and you did mention this, fathers are victims or were victims of colonialism, and their trauma, their collective trauma affects us all. And I think that goes very much to the heart of what you're interrogating here.
Yeah.
So I think we are almost out of time, but I just we are out of time. Correct.
Oh wow! Yeah, wow. That went wonderfully. That was great. That was just great.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. If anybody would like to check out more of Arisa's work, please check out her website at arisawhite.com. And I'd like to end by borrowing a few lines of poetry from one of Arisa's earlier books, which I think really sums up all that's been said today. Deep inside the quiet, deep parting of private seas, we go story after story. On behalf of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, thank you all for tuning in, and have a great week.
Thank you so much, Andre.